Let's take a look at some examples of single-family detached housing that is compact in nature. And what we mean by compact are homes that are placed on lots so that at least 7 to 8 units are achieved per acre. That doesn't seem like a lot, but in many small and medium-sized American cities, that is the upper threshold for single-family housing. If we look at the diagram that we're providing here, an overlay of 9 city blocks surrounding a park, we can see there are several different of these blocks where single-family detached housing is in occurrence. Here we can see a typical block where a variety of small and medium-sized homes is detached but arranged around a common open space. One of the ways that open space can be achieved is in ganged backyards or simply in a sense of a public space behind private homes. And that's the case here in Lytton Park Place, St. Paul, Minnesota. Lytton Park is 7 units per acre, which in that particular neighborhood was considered high density. And as you can see, the design strategy for achieving the density is to evoke the older Victorian style of the neighborhood. Front porches, pitched roofs, and other decorative elements give scale to the buildings. You can see they're actually fairly far apart because that's what the zoning required, and they have large front yards. To achieve the density, in this case, the backyards are rather small. Parking is accessed through alleys at the rear. So in this case, the public feeling is fairly low density because of the wide spacing between the houses, the front porches and other design elements that break down the scale of the house, and the front setbacks. Let's compare that to Benson Glen. Now, at a similar density, this being 7.2 units per acre, we get a very different feeling from this project. It's at the same density. What makes the difference? At Benson Glen, the houses are primarily one floor with an additional second story, so the footprint of the house is bigger. Also, the houses are closer to the street, as you can see. On the other hand, the houses have much bigger backyards than they had at Lytton Park. In this case, with no rear alleys, valuable front yard space had to be taken up to get the cars off the street, and it was handled well by the architect, but that meant that the house and the combined garage makes the building wider than in the previous example. All in all, the same density, but a very different feeling. Equally attractive, in this case, a bigger variety of housing styles and types, as you can see, but a much greater amount of private open space is gained by this layout, lesser amount of front yard space. Now we're in Chicago, and the Quincy homes, 2 units more per acre. This is at 9 units an acre, and still most people can't tell the difference between this and the previous examples. What makes this density fit in? Notice the space between the houses and think back to the Lytton Park and even Benson Glen examples. The houses are now closer together. That means that the lots are narrower, but they're actually rather deep, and in this case there are alleys in the rear yards for some of the houses, and others, as you see in the foreground, actually share garage courts. In this case, the houses are raised up so that there's actually a full basement under the homes, which is a great amount of interior living space. These units are actually bigger than in either of the previous 2 examples. Bigger buildings, smaller lots, closer together, and yet large front setbacks actually create breathing room. And notice in this example, unlike the previous 2, that the setbacks vary. Some houses are closer, others are further away from the street. And this is the pattern that actually existed in the Chicago neighborhood. So the houses fit into the old pattern, and they also achieve a real balance between front yards and backyards. They're about of equal size. One interesting thing to note about this example is some homes have their garage off the front street, and it's in the basement. Great in a winter climate, but it takes up valuable space for paving. Others have double-car garages, but in an alley in the rear yard. Alleys and rear yards are places where kids play, and also garages are places where people do projects. And having them remote from the house has certain advantages, although in the winter it means walking through the snow. So there are different choices in the same project. Some people like the attached garage under the building. Some people like it far in the backyard on the alley. In this self-help home project in Santa Rosa, California, the interesting thing is most people would say, oh, this looks less dense than any of the previous examples. In this case, at 14 units an acre, this is almost twice the density of Lytton Park. What makes this feel that it's about the same density or less? This actually used the strategy of what's called wide shallow. If you look closely, the houses seem wide, that is, their frontage on the street has some length to it, and there's space between them, but they actually have fairly shallow backyards. This allows a drive to a garage and a fairly large front porch and a side yard, all to fit along the frontage of the street. Rather shallow front yards, but all the architectural features, the porches, the trellises, the gazebos, the elements that break down the scale of the houses and add texture, make the houses actually feel further back from the street than they really are. They're hardly one car's length back from the street. So in all cases in this particular development, and some of the houses are located on side streets and side small lanes, the houses have a shallow backyard, but they have a lot of private space and light and air between and amongst themselves. Less open space than the previous examples, but equally feeling compatible with the existing neighbors around them. Let's take a look at the next example. We're moving up in density. Now we're also near Santa Rosa, the same nonprofit, 16 units an acre, and in this case the houses are even closer to the street. We can't even get a car in, about 6-foot front yards, and the cars are tucked around in the back. Let's contrast that development, which is in California, which is slightly less density than this, the Randolph neighborhood. Now, notice in the Randolph neighborhood, we have traditional East Coast row houses. They're actually separated from one another by 3 feet. Here's an example where, although this is dense housing compared to surrounding neighborhoods in Richmond, Virginia, the original plan was to be even more dense. What happened through the design review process, the neighbors insisted that nobody would want to live in a house that touched another one. And so the houses were pulled 3 feet apart. And in this case, you can see that from the blank walls. Other than that compact development, it does achieve a density of almost 20 units an acre when you average these large single-family detached homes in with some 2- and 4-unit multiplex apartments further down the road. Traditional detailing, parking, access from the back creates a lot of front yard and porch space, which is great in this climate. People spend a lot of time in their fronts in this part of the country. Now we're at a development called Metro Square. We've come back to California. These are very compact houses. This particular example is actually a mixed income development. And market rate people seem to have no fear living this close to one another. What's unusual about this development is the green space you see in the front is actually the median of what might have been a wide public street. The developer convinced the city not to have a 60-foot wide street, but a very small access lane to access the parking. You see the garages are right there in the front. And then the median became actually a play area. Only 3 or 4 houses, and in this case 6, line one small lane, which doubles as a sidewalk. And it actually works because very few people speed down these ways to get into their units. And this is how 21 units an acre can be achieved. Virtually no major public space here, a tiny backyard, a small front porch, but a great community commons.